A recent investigation has revealed that the CIA's torture program was not only a systematic violation of human rights, but also an illegal regime of human experimentation. The findings, based on thousands of declassified documents, indicate that health professionals involved in designing and implementing the program engaged in unethical and unlawful human subject research. This experimentation was not incidental, but rather an intentional effort to study the psychological and physical effects of ill treatment, effectively using detainees as unwilling test subjects. The report sheds light on a deeply troubling chapter in intelligence operations, exposing the extent to which professionals tasked with ensuring human welfare were instead complicit in grave violations. At the heart of this revelation is the role of health professionals who went beyond merely overseeing interrogations. These individuals, including doctors and psychologists, were not only present during these sessions, but were actively involved in researching the effects of various interrogation techniques. The primary goal of this experimentation was to test the hypothesis that ill treatment could break detainees psychologically, making them more susceptible to providing information. This was not simply a matter of observing and documenting outcomes. It was a structured effort to refine and optimize methods of psychological and physical coercion. The evidence suggests that detainees were subjected to repeated and prolonged exposure to torture, with adjustments made based on the observed impact on their mental and physical states. The report shows that this constituted human experimentation in its most unethical form. Under US and international law, human subject research is bound by strict ethical guidelines, including informed consent and the prohibition of harm. The CIA's torture program, however, ignored these fundamental principles, treating detainees as experimental subjects without their knowledge or consent. Techniques such as waterboarding, sleep deprivation, sensory deprivation, and forced stress positions were applied not only as interrogation methods, but also as variables in a larger experimental framework. The findings suggest that rather than using these techniques solely to extract information, interrogators and health professionals were also monitoring how long individuals could endure them and what effects they had on their psychological state. The complicity of psychologists in this program is particularly troubling. Psychologists were not only instrumental in designing the ill treatment methods, but were also financially compensated for their role in conducting research on detainees. They played a direct part in shaping interrogation tactics based on their findings, effectively making them architects of a system that inflicted extreme suffering in the name of intelligence gathering. These professionals should have been bound by ethical guidelines that prioritize the well-being of individuals, yet they actively participated in a program that violated the very foundations of medical and psychological ethics. Furthermore, the program's structure indicates that data was systematically collected, analyzed, and used to refine techniques over time. This level of documentation and iteration suggests a clear research framework, one that would be instantly recognizable as human experimentation if conducted under any other circumstances. The fact that this occurred under the auspices of a government agency does not absolve it from scrutiny. Rather, it heightens the responsibility to hold those involved accountable. The report highlights that detainees were not only hurt, but were also subjected to continuous observation, with interrogators and medical personnel documenting their responses to various forms of abuse. This raises serious concerns about the extent to which these individuals were viewed as human beings rather than as test subjects in a cruel and secretive research program. The legal implications of these findings are profound. Under the Nuremberg Code, established in response to the atrocities committed by doctors during World War II, human experimentation without informed consent is strictly prohibited. The code serves as one of the cornerstones of modern medical ethics, emphasizing that individuals must never be subjected to medical experimentation against their will. The CIA's program, as outlined in this report, appears to have directly violated these principles, placing it in clear violation of both US and international law. Additionally, the Geneva Conventions explicitly prohibit cruel and inhumane treatment of prisoners, reinforcing the argument that this program constitutes a severe breach of legal and ethical standards. The revelation that human experimentation was a key component of the torture program fundamentally alters the public perception of what transpired. While discussions about CIA's ill treatment techniques have previously focused on the morality and effectiveness of enhanced interrogation techniques, this report shifts the conversation to a much darker reality. It is no longer just a question of whether these methods produced reliable intelligence. It is a question of whether an entire research program was designed to exploit human suffering in pursuit of psychological control. This distinction is critical because it reframes the program not as a misguided effort to prevent terrorism, but as a deliberate and systematic violation of human rights in the name of experimental research. The involvement of medical professionals in such a program also raises questions about institutional accountability. Organizations like the American Psychological Association have faced criticism for their previous failure to condemn psychologists' participation in programs. The findings of this report reinforce the need for greater oversight and accountability within the medical and psychological communities. Professionals who willingly participated in these experiments not only violated their ethical obligations, but also betrayed the fundamental trust placed in them by society. Holding these individuals accountable is not just a matter of justice, it is a necessary step toward preventing similar abuses in the future. Despite these revelations, the full extent of the program's impact remains unknown. Many of the detainees subjected to these experiments continue to suffer from severe psychological trauma, with some still held in indefinite detention. The long-term consequences of their treatment have yet to be fully acknowledged, and the lack of accountability for those responsible only adds to the injustice. If history has shown anything, it is that such programs do not simply disappear, they leave lasting scars on both individuals and institutions. Reckoning with this dark chapter requires more than just exposing the truth. It demands meaningful action to ensure that such abuses are never repeated. The report's findings challenge the notion that the program was merely an unfortunate misstep in the war on terror. Instead, it reveals a calculated and systematic effort to experiment on human subjects in violation of every ethical standard governing medical and psychological research. The evidence presented leaves little room for doubt. The CIA's program was not just about intelligence gathering, but was also an illegal research initiative designed to push the boundaries of human endurance under extreme duress. The implications of this discovery are far-reaching, requiring urgent attention and accountability at the highest levels. This is not just a matter of national security, it is a matter of human rights and justice that cannot be ignored. Many researchers believe that the CIA's program is only one part of a much larger web of secret experiments that have been covered up and hidden from public scrutiny. While some details have surfaced through declassified documents, countless programs are likely to have been buried so deep that they may never come to light. The idea that intelligence agencies have engaged in secret human experimentation is not speculation. It is an established fact. The worrying part is that the extent of these programs remains unknown, and what has been uncovered is likely just the tip of the iceberg. One of the most alarming aspects of these revelations is that many of these experiments were not conducted on foreign enemies or captured militants, but on American citizens themselves. Throughout history, there have been numerous examples of the US government subjecting its own people to unethical experiments without their knowledge or consent. The fact that agencies tasked with national security have used their own citizens as test subjects raises serious ethical and moral concerns. It calls into question how far the government has gone in its pursuit of scientific and military advancements, and whether those in power have deliberately withheld information from the public to avoid accountability. Similarly, during the Cold War, the government conducted radiation experiments on unknowing Americans. Pregnant women were given radioactive iron without their consent to study its effects on fetal development. Prisoners and hospital patients were injected with plutonium to observe how radiation spread through the body. Many of these victims were left with irreversible damage, their suffering ignored in the name of national security. These experiments highlight a disturbing pattern: government agencies operating in secrecy, subjecting their own citizens to inhumane treatment while shielding themselves from accountability. The recent report on the CIA's program suggests that these types of experiments did not stop with these projects. Instead, they evolved into new forms, hidden behind classified documents and protected by national security justifications. The claim that medical professionals were involved in testing the effects of torture on detainees is particularly disturbing. It indicates that these programs were not merely about intelligence gathering, but were also about refining coercion techniques and pushing the limits of human endurance. The lack of oversight allowed these experiments to continue unchecked, making it likely that similar projects exist today, hidden from public view. One of the greatest concerns is that the full extent of these programs may never be known. Intelligence agencies have long perfected the art of covering their tracks, destroying records, and ensuring that those involved remain silent. Even when programs are exposed, the government often refuses to acknowledge wrongdoing, relying on bureaucratic denials and classification loopholes to keep the truth buried. The likelihood that similar projects are still being conducted, shielded from public scrutiny, is not far-fetched. If history has shown anything, it is that secrecy and power often lead to abuses that only come to light decades later, if at all. Another troubling factor is the justification used for these programs. Time and again, the government has claimed that such experiments are necessary for national security. Whether it was the Cold War, the War on Terror, or other perceived threats, secrecy has always been justified by the need to protect the country. However, these justifications have often been used as a shield to cover up unethical practices. The government has manipulated the concept of security to justify human experimentation, torture, and the violation of basic human rights. This raises an important question. Where is the line drawn, and who decides what is acceptable in the name of national defense? The use of American citizens as test subjects in government experiments should serve as a wake-up call. These programs highlight the dangers of unchecked power and the consequences of allowing intelligence agencies to operate without transparency. The potential for abuse increases when those in control believe they are above the law. If the government was willing to conduct experiments on its own people in the past, there is little reason to believe that similar activities are not taking place today under different names and classifications. The lack of accountability for these programs is one of the most frustrating aspects of the issue. Even when evidence emerges, those responsible are rarely held accountable. Officials responsible for past experiments have often escaped consequences by citing national security concerns or claiming that the actions were justified by the circumstances of the time. This failure to enforce accountability only emboldens those who continue to operate in the shadows, knowing that they can act without fear of repercussions. The secrecy surrounding these programs also has significant implications for trust in government institutions. When the public learns that their own government has lied to them about conducting experiments on its citizens, it fosters a deep sense of betrayal. People begin to question what else is being hidden, and whether those in power truly have the public's best interests in mind. This erosion of trust can have long-term consequences, making it difficult for the government to function effectively and for citizens to believe in the integrity of their institutions. If these programs are ever to be fully exposed, it will require determined efforts from independent researchers, whistleblowers, and investigative journalists. Transparency must become a priority, and the public must demand accountability for past and present human experimentation. Without pressure from the people, these programs will remain buried, their victims forgotten, and their perpetrators protected. The fact that the government has conducted experiments on its own citizens is deeply troubling, and the possibility that similar programs continue today is even more alarming.